Welcome to session 5 of the Tourette Syndrome National Conference for 2020. I'm very pleased to introduce our next presenter, who is David Jereb. David is an occupational therapist at Move About Therapy Services and Sensibility in New South Wales. I really wanted to hear from an occupational therapist for Tourette syndrome, as we haven't had a speaker in this space before. And I was recently in a radio interview following on from an occupational therapist and was listening to what they were talking about and thought that they really do have a lot to offer for people with Tourette syndrome and associated and comorbid conditions. Now, David is a skilled professional, but a big kid at heart, I've heard. He was always going to work with children and families, loving to use play and relationship development to support children to grow to their fullest. He loves learning, teaching and creating. And with Kathy Jereb, he owns Move About Therapy Services and Sensibility, created the Move About activity cards and has developed and presented numerous workshops. So today he's going to talk to us in relation to Tourette's and how he manages and approaches regulation and behaviour. Thank you, David.
No worries. Thank you, Robin. Okay, so we're going to look at a dynamic approach to regulation and behaviour, which I have to confess is a full-day workshop, and I was a little surprised when that was the title. So I got a little bit worried about how dynamic I can be in 40 minutes, but let's see how we go. We're going to move through this pretty quickly. I'm also going to go pretty quickly through the slides that much bigger and better brains than my own have already gone through today. Okay, so Robin's gone through it. That's my beautiful wife, Kathy, and I'll keep moving. So we are Move About. So as you've heard a lot of today, Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition that affects the central nervous system, results in involuntary movements and vocalizations called tics. It's a spectrum-based disorder, so it ranges from very mild to severe, and it usually begins in childhood. So tics are sudden, rapid, recurrent, non-rhythmic motor movements or vocalizations. So they're a primary feature of Tourette syndrome. They can be mild or more severe. They can be classified as simple or complex, and they can impact engagement in occupational performance. So I'm going to take this opportunity to tell people what an occupational therapist actually is. So occupational therapists support people with their occupations. You may think of the word occupation as meaning work, but we think about it more broadly, sort of what occupies your time. So we really support people in activities of daily living. So we look at cognitive, psychosocial, sensory and motor components of that. With kids, we're often known around fine motor, gross motor skills, sensory processing, a range of different things related to activities of daily living. So tics can impact engagement in occupational performance. That's those activities of daily living, physical activities, play, social interaction, learning and employment. Okay, so again, you've heard this a few times today, but they tend to have a waxing and waning to them. So there's times when they're heightened or more frequent and times when they decrease. And so James talked to us about how they can be heightened under stress. And so some of the regulation supports that we'll talk about today, and that actually they also talked about some really great regulation supports too, and actually even Ivan did as well. So regulation strategies can be helpful for heightening that stress response and thus reducing them. There's also some information that suggests that they can be reduced when engrossed in a task or an activity. Again, James talked about, I think he talked about finding joyous experiences and things that he found as positive experiences. But if we can find things that are meaningful activity that people can be absorbed into and find that just right challenge, that can also be helpful. And they're impacted by environment and occupation. So again, we often focus on the person, but that's really only 1/3 of our opportunities to be able to support individuals is helping them to change something within themselves. Hopefully from today and all the speakers you've heard, you'll identify ways that we can change the environment, including the social environment and how we understand these things, and change the occupation, so those tasks and activities that they're doing in a way that supports regulation and supports the individual. And they have premonitory urges as well. So those Premonitory urges, as we've heard again, they're a sensation prior to the tic that's often localized in the area of the tic. I think Dennis said they were up to 90%. This study suggested even 92% of adults experience those premonitory urges. In children, it's significantly less. And I think Ivan mentioned that this is likely due to cognitive development. I think tuning into those premonitory urges requires a level of body awareness and also a level of cognitive development in order to be able to identify them and associate them with the behavioural response that's about to come. Again, behaviour not in an Australian sense of naughty behaviour, but behaviour in a scientific sense, thinking about what really a behaviour is, an action that occurs. Anything that we do in a scientific sense can be called behaviour. So, challenges with regulation will also impact a person's ability to tune into their body and their ability to process information cognitively. So if you're not regulated, you're not in a place where you can learn strategies such as habit reversal training. And you're also, if you're not regulated when it's time to use those strategies, it's going to really make it hard to access that learning that you've had. Okay, again, today we've heard about all the other diagnoses that can be associated. And certainly there's ADHD, OCD, psychosocial difficulties, anxiety and mood disorders, learning disorders, and sleep disorders. So I guess what I want you to get a sense of is that all of these impact the ability to learn and retrieve top-down strategies. They also put stresses on regulation just in daily life, which can then heighten the person, making it more likely to exacerbate those tics. And these are also impacted by your state of regulation. So these things all kind of intertwine, and if we're not regulated, it really makes it more likely that tics will come out, as well as it makes it hard to use the skills that we've developed to deal with those. So treatment, the studies talk about components of education, supportive care, watchful waiting for milder tics, behavioural therapies such as habit reversal training and the CBIT that we just heard about, self-monitoring and relaxation therapy. I think when I'm talking about regulation strategies, there's going to be overlap with the literature talking about relaxation therapy. And then medications are often not considered the first response because they can have side effects. So we want to try and see if there are other options that we have that have less risks involved. So Ivan was just fantastic in explaining CBIT to us. That includes aspects of education, awareness training, competing response training, and functional interventions. So I'll certainly link that to environment and occupational supports. Adjusting those environments, adjusting the physical environment or the sensory environment would be things that we talk about in this session, as well as the social environment. So the people around us, our family and our friends, teachers, how do we support the person who has Tourette syndrome is a really important aspect. And then occupational support. So how do we adapt the task to support that person or to ensure that regulation isn't completely challenged by the activities that we're doing. Okay, so this was an interesting study that looked at a few different therapies that are currently used: habit reversal training, self-monitoring, and relaxation therapy. And the good news is that all three produced a reduction in tics and they were beneficial. Now you might look at that and say, well, habit reversal is much better than relaxation therapy, and it did help 55% of a reduction of tics. What I would say is that I think often they're used in combination, and so I think you would find it would be unlikely to have a lot of habit reversal training without some kind of supports for regulation, for regulation such as relaxation therapy. So the other cool thing was that each of these was identified as most effective for at least one subject. So each of these was better than the others for at least one person in this study, which suggests that we really need to have an individualized approach and find what's the right match for the person right in front of us. And they're often used in conjunction, as I said. So yeah, we need to think about what's the best match or what's the best combination for the individual. Cognitive and behavioral strategies such as CBIT and habit reversal training, they require a level of cognitive development and abilities, as we heard. They require access to high level cortical processing and executive functions during the learning and implementation phase. So they also require that level of body awareness to tune into those premonitory urges. So for young kids, it can often be tricky if they haven't reached that developmental level or if they're not tuned into their body. I think also it's important to note that challenges with regulation and stress impact an individual's ability to use those cognitive and behavioral strategies. So again, it's hard to learn when you're not in a regulated state, when you're not in that optimal zone. So we'll talk about what is that and how do we get there. So challenges with attention, learning, regulation, stress and anxiety, they all make it more difficult to learn and retrieve those top-down strategies. So we want to support regulation, right? You know, for all of us. This information coming up will be helpful for all of us. And there are some strategies that I myself use because they're helpful. They could be certainly helpful for reducing milder symptoms and for supporting during that watchful waiting time. They may reduce those exacerbations that arise from stress and excitement. So if we're less heightened, tics are likely to be less severe. And they allow individuals to maintain an optimal level of neurological arousal. So that's how awake your brain is. So you want to be awake and alert, but calm and grounded in order to be in the optimal place. And that's for learning and retrieving those strategies, but also just engaging in life, engaging with people, engaging in school, engaging in the workplace. These strategies are accessible, they're easy to implement, they're cost effective. You know, a lot of them are virtually free once you have them. And there are people around that can help you with this. Most OTs will be able to help with sensory diet strategies, and OTs or speechies can help with visual strategies to support predictability that we'll talk about. So they're quite accessible. So what is regulation? So self-regulation, it's more than just sensory, although OTs often tend to focus on the sensory. I'm going to use the sensory profile models presented by Winnie Dunn as a bit of a framework, and that's really where OTs do start, but I want you to know that it goes beyond sensory. Self-regulation is the ability to adjust your level of alertness to match the task you're doing. These profiles can include being a sensory defensive or sensory avoider, to be low arousal, sensory seeking, and narrow band. So most people have heard of the fight, fright, flight zone, where you're in that panic mode or fight, flight, freeze. That's that high zone. So we often talk about sometimes my engine runs low, sometimes it runs high, sometimes it runs just right. Well, that just right is the optimal range. And so if you're moving from low, where you're a bit of an Eeyore, where you're just alive and then you're becoming awake, into that optimal range where you're calm and alert, maybe enthusiastic, and then that higher zone where you flip your lid in that fight or flight and freeze is up there. I like this model because we don't often talk about this agitated, overexcited zone. So this is the zone when you're having an argument with your spouse or your sibling and everyone's talking and no one's listening. You get quite rigid, you're inflexible, you're hearing but you're not listening. And it can be overexcited as well as that agitated zone. And that is a heightened state that I think can be something that's important to recognize. So if I'm going to look at a typical day for myself, I wake up in the morning and I am in the low zone. I must have a shower. It is not negotiable. And so when I'm teaching this course face-to-face with a group of people, I often get people to raise their hand if they're a morning shower person or an evening shower person. I say morning and about half the room lifts their hand. I say evening, the other half of the room lifts their hand. And then usually there's about 8 people that have a shower both in the morning and the evening. Now, not all of that is about regulation. Not all of it is about waking their body up and calming their body down. If you're a tradie and you're dirty and you get home, of course you're going to have a shower. But for a lot of us, for me, I can't function if I don't have that shower to wake up. The times that I'm going to the airport, so I think I'll skip a shower to save time, it ends up taking me 10 minutes longer to get ready in the morning because I didn't have a 5-minute shower. So I wake up, I have my shower, I have my coffee, I run around and get ready. I have my second coffee, maybe my third, and I get into the car and I'm still a little sleepy. So I might push on the steering wheel and give myself a little bit of proprioception. So that's input to your muscles and joints, a bit of heavy work. And that push really sort of helps me feel grounded and in my body and wakes me up a little bit. I turn the music up nice and loud, jack up some AC/DC or something to get me going, and I'm awake and I'm ready for my day. And I'm off for the day. And I have a job that I jump and crash and crawl and climb and swing for a living. I have swings, a ball pit, slides. The ball pit's getting a little less use at the moment, but I have all these things that are really good for keeping me as a bit of a sensory seeker in my optimal range. I might have a bit of a dip after lunch, and let's say towards the end of the day, I'm feeling a little bit stressed out, a little bit heightened, I'm running late. I go out to the car and then there's funny noises, the lights are flickering, I drop my keys, pick them up, I get in the car and I turn on the ignition and I'm blasted with AC/DC at full volume. And I panic and turn the ignition off and the problem's solved, right? Well, the problem's not quite solved because in my car, you can't turn the volume down when the ignition's off. So I'm going to have to turn it on and get blasted again. So what that shows you is that when I'm in the high zone, I'm not thinking clearly. Dan Siegel talks about flipping your lid, and you don't have access to that top part of your brain that is that thinking part of your brain, that's that top-down regulator, and you're using your more brainstem. So I went into kind of a little flight mode, and I panicked and flew away and got rid of the problem. So now I have to think about, but I recovered quite quickly, and I'm in a place that I can think about a plan. So I take a deep breath. Maybe I push on the steering wheel here to feel a bit grounded in my body, and that probe to the muscles helps me feel a little grounded this time. Take a breath. I prepare myself, turn it on, turn it down. And when I turn it on, I get blasted again and turn down the volume. Take another breath and I'm okay. Incidentally, I talked about not being able to think clearly in the high zone. The same's true in the low zone. So sometimes I've had this one experience where I felt so I'm like, I need a Barocca as well as my coffee. I got my coffee, my water for the Barocca, went and got the Barocca and put it in the coffee. And that was not quite right, yeah? And that's because my brain hadn't woken up to that higher level process at that stage. So when you're in the high, when you're in the low, you're not able to think clearly, to reason, to process very well. In terms of sensory systems, we all have sensory systems. We all have sensory diet. So this input across the day is my sensory diet. We don't all have good sensory diet. Sometimes the same sensory thing, like using proprioception, your muscles and joints, can bring you up if you're down and down if you're up. So I pushed on the steering wheel to wake up in the morning, but I also did it to feel more grounded when I was stressed out after the loud noise. The loud noise is a good example of that. Was exactly the same volume, the same part of the song, where I left it in the car, but it was great in the morning because I was in control of it. I knew it was coming and it woke me up. In the evening, it caught me by surprise and I was already a bit edgy, so it flipped me over and put me into fight flight. After that, I was able to predict, I was in control, I knew it was coming. So even though I was still quite heightened, because I had a way of predicting it was coming and I had a sense of control over it, when I turned it on, I was able to keep my lid on while I turned the volume down so that then I could think and reason and plan without flipping my lid and going to those automatic reflexive responses. Okay, so let's look at a couple of patterns. Low arousal, this is your Eeyore. So Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, he is low arousal. He gets called lazy or lethargic or a plodder. And he just kind of plods along and never quite gets to that crisp. And so he really needs a lot of input to get him going. I've worked with kids that take forever to respond, but then I stick them in Lycra clouds and I bounce them around and they do some climbing and things get a lot quicker. So these guys, we need to wake them up so that they can think and reason and be able to engage. I also want to say I work with kids, so apologies. I think these strategies are good for all of us, but I try to say individual in these kind of talks, but sometimes I fall into the default of saying kids or children. So Eeyore had that big low zone. I'm going to tell you that Tigger also has a big low zone, and you think, well, how can this sensory seeker Tigger, who's bouncing off the walls, have a big low zone? He's so high. Well, the thing is, we're not talking about activity level. We're talking about neurological arousal. So this is how awake is his brain, and his brain is sleepy. But instead of giving into it and plodding along like Eeyore, he seeks and seeks and seeks and seeks and seeks, trying to wake his body up. So he's constantly on the move, or he's constantly touching things or putting things in his mouth. So Tiger seeks and seeks and seeks. Now his body gives you some good clues about what his body thinks is useful, and it's pretty clever. It may not always choose the most organizing. So often we see that tigers seek and seek and seek, and then they go too far and overshoot, and they might hit that high zone. So we can find ways to find more organizing input for them. And then sensory defensive are people who overreact to certain stimulation. So they tend to hit that high zone quicker, stay there longer, and take longer to recover. So where I sort of went into that high zone and then came back down once it was gone, they might take minutes or hours or even need a sleep to recover from it. So they could, in terms of Winnie the Pooh characters, could be like Piglet and be really anxious. They could also be like Owl or Rabbit and be quite controlling so that things don't set them off. Or even like Tigger, and it might look different to this graph, but they might seek and seek and seek, trying to find a way to feel more grounded. So I work with kids who over-respond to touch and sound, so they might seek movement and heavy work for their muscles to try and feel more grounded. Okay, so this isn't really a separate profile, but any of these could be narrow band. This is really just suggesting that that just right zone for some people is a lot more narrow. So this could be an Eeyore that overshoots or a Tigger that overshoots. But it's important to notice that some people really have trouble hitting that just right zone, and they go from woe to go really quickly. Okay, so the profiles aren't so simple. Realistically, we can't squeeze people into boxes, and you can have a combination of these profiles. You can have a different pattern of response in each sense. And regulation really isn't quite so linear, but that's a great way to, I think, represent it when you're teaching people it. And it has both tonic and phasic components. So tonic is really, how does that curve go? What's your curve? What's your profile throughout the day if no one messes with you? And then phasic is maybe how narrow that band is and how quickly you shoot up. And so an OT will often be trained in helping understand that different profile and different pattern and helping find those solutions to that. Okay, and here's an example of a reactive Eeyore. So Eeyore might be quite low and lethargic when nothing's really messing with them, but if they're also defensive to touch or reactive and anxious around other things, they might hit that high zone quite quickly. So they still have a big low zone, but that optimal band might be a bit narrow and they hit that high as well. Okay, so this is one of the first models OTs learn in university, and it's just such a beautiful model because it reminds us that occupational performance, that's the ability to engage in the things we do in life, is a combination of person, environment, and occupation. And I talked about that a bit earlier, and I think that when we focus on the person, we only have 1/3 of the solutions. There are things in environment and occupation that can really support the person with Tourette syndrome to be able to be more regulated and to be able to be more functional in daily life. So friends of mine and mentors of mine, Tracy Stackhouse and Julie Wilbarger, along with Sharon Trinell, created the STEP SI model. Now this is really just the PE model expanded, the person, environment, occupation model expanded in many ways. So sensation, sensory, motor, posture are aspects of the person. Task comes under occupation. Environment in this model sort of looks more at the physical and sensory environment. Predictability is an aspect of the task, but knowing what's coming up. Self-monitoring is an aspect of the person, and interaction is really the social environment. So I'm going to start to give you suggestions for supporting regulation from this framework. Okay, so the first is that sensation, sorry, I've moved ahead. So in sensation, we all use sensory input. Sensory processing is really information comes in from our senses. We use it to make our plan, and then our body performs that plan. So our senses give us information about our body and the world. They tell us what's available in the world and what we need to do in the task in front of us. They also help wake our body up or calm our bodies down. And so that's what we call sensory diet. Again, that's not food per se, but it's the different senses, the input from the senses that help wake our body up and calm our body down so that we can be calm, alert, awake and alert, but calm and grounded. So we all have sensory diets, but we don't all have good sensory diets. So what are sensory diets? Sensory diets are a plan of specific activities that support an individual's ability to remain in a functional state of alertness or arousal. So they're activities that get us in that just right state, that optimal range, so that we can engage in activities of daily life. And optimal can be different from person to person, and it can be different from one activity to another. We use sensory diet to set up an individual's body for success, body and brain for success. So they're often set up activities prior to a challenging task or a task we might find stressful. We also use them to support during activities and learning. So we might consider when a break's necessary, and we want to put those in before those challenges. And we want to consider the person's individual profile. So there's not a one size fits all. We're going to look at what are their sensory preferences, what does their body think is going to be helpful. And not all sensory is equal. So different activities will have aspects of intensity, frequency, duration, rhythmicity, and accessibility. So that's how powerful is this activity? How often do you have to do it to have an effect? How long do you have to do it for? And does it have a rhythmic component? And can you actually do it during or prior to the task that you're doing? So in order to set up a sensory diet, we're going to observe the individual's sensory motor preferences. Do they seek a lot of movement? Do they fidget with things in their hands? Do they like to put things in their mouth? Then we're going to look at the rhythms of the day. So when are the highs and lows? When are the peaks and valleys? When do challenges happen? And then can we put things in just before the challenging task or throughout the challenging task in order to be able to support the individual? So again, they have these aspects of intensity, frequency, duration, rhythmicity, and accessibility. So not all sensory is equal. So not all sensory is just as intense or just as powerful. A fidget toy, like a stress ball, is nowhere near as intense as jumping on a trampoline or having a wrestle and rumble with dad. For an adult, it might be that chewing gum is not as intense as a boxing class. And so because it's not as intense, you're going to have to do those things more frequently or for longer duration. So using a fidget toy as a way of sitting through circle time at school, it's pretty much going to have to be continuous frequency and duration. Both jumping on a trampoline and using a fidget toy have aspects of rhythmicity potentially. And so while it's less intense, it's certainly more accessible during circle time than jumping on a trampoline or doing a boxing class. So none is right or wrong. Some are a better fit for certain things. For some kids, we might want to do some jumping and crashing or climbing on the monkey bars before circle time, and then use a fidget toy during circle time, or use some gum to chew on during circle time, or during learning, or during homework. So sensory diets can include sensation. So I'm going to add two pieces of sensation that sometimes people haven't heard of. So sensation is taste and smell and sight and hearing and vision. Oh, I said vision. Taste and smell and sound and vision. I don't know. I've haven't got them in front of me to know what they are. Taste, smell, sound, vision, and touch. But then it also includes proprioception and vestibular input. And these are really your big guns. And so that's why I've started with them. Proprioception is input to your muscles and joints. So they help you know where your body is positioned in space. And so if I close my eyes, I know my left hand is by my left ear and now it's down and now it's up. That's because I have receptors in my joints and muscles and skin. They're my proprioceptors. But so basically we get input to them, which we call heavy work, through pushing, pulling, weight bearing, climbing. So in my scenario, you saw me push on the steering wheel to wake my body up, but also to calm my body down, because proprioception tends to be quite centering. It brings you up when you're down and down when you're up. Vestibular input, that's your movement sense. So your sense of balance. You have this mechanism in your ear that registers where is that mechanism on both sides in relation to gravity. Am I moving forwards, backwards, left, right, up and down? It tells me when I'm tipping so that I can adjust my posture so I don't fall. It tells me when I'm falling so I can put my hands out. So vestibular, irregular vestibular, crazy wrestle, rumble, crash and bump tends to rev you up. But if it's in a straight line or has an element of rhythmicity, it tends to be calming you down. And so I think about the trampoline. one child on a trampoline almost always looks organized, almost always looks good. It's really hard to dysregulate as one child on a trampoline because it doesn't work if you're not rhythmic. And it's fairly linear and up and down. And no matter what you're doing, whether you're doing flips, the kid looks good. Put a second or a third kid on and it's irregular and it revs you up. It's not wrong, but that irregular movement wakes you up, while rhythmic linear movement tends to be more grounding and more centering. Touch experiences also have two elements. Deep pressure touch tends to be calming, whereas light touch, fidget tends to be alerting. We know that tickle sort of rev us up, whereas sort of big squeezy bear hugs or massage tend to be more calming. Okay, so sensory diets can include respiration. So sucking and blowing activities, blowing bubbles, potentially whistles if the sound doesn't set you off. Bubble tubs are just either a bubble pipe. You might get a cup with some dish liquid and water in it, and you can blow with a straw and it comes out, or a big bubble tub where you make it bigger and it comes out. We do those with kids. We see adults doing meditation often includes breath elements to it as well. The mouth, chew and suck, I find tend to be quite centering and organizing and sort of calm you down. Bite and crunch tends to be alerting, but again, this is different for the individual, so make sure we're reading each person and what their nervous system says works. Then we also have visual, auditory, olfactory is smell, gustatory is taste. And so visual and auditory I find are more environmental features that we'll talk about. Okay, cool downs, these are many of the same ones, but often people sort of say, well, how do I get the kid to calm down? So I put this slide in. Again, that proprioception and heavy work, deep pressure touch. So we do squishes with pillows, steam rollers with a gym ball can often be quite calming. For an adult, it might be going and getting a deep tissue massage. It might be something that's really grounding. Respiration we talked about, and rhythm. The ideal rhythm to be calming in that just right zone, that calm alert, is 50 to 70 beats per minute. So Cool Bananas is an album that's actually my sister, who's also an OT and a musician, and she's created an album where it starts at 70 beats per minute, which is sort of awake, alert, but calm for learning, down to 50 beats, which is sort of getting ready for bed. So it progresses throughout the track. Sacred Earth Drums has a nice strong beat as well. Creating a safe place is something that I know that Valsa mentioned, and she had a lot of great suggestions around cool downs as well. Use of voice, so engagement is something we'll talk about in a minute, but how we use our voice can be quite comforting and regulating for someone else. What I want you to consider though, if someone is a Tigger, we need to think about, does their nervous system need to calm down or does it need to calm up though? So we might need to get cues more from their body rather than trying to calm them down per se. Okay, so sensory processing and sensory diets are not the same as sensory stimulation or sensory bombardment. More is not always better, and it's about finding the right match for the person. Sometimes I've seen a group of people play with slime or goo that people have made, and one person finds it like engaging and enlivening, another person finds it calming and soothing, and another person will not touch it and is completely set off by it. So not all sensory input is regulating as well, and not all is sufficient. So we talked about the power and that recipe of frequency, intensity, duration, rhythmicity, and accessibility. Okay, so self-monitoring, I'm going to move through quickly, but essentially there are things where we can tune into our own body so that we can choose strategies to help ourselves. Two programs that we often use in OT, and I think psychs do too, are the alert program for self-regulation is more of an OT one, and that's very sensory based. Zones of regulation is a little more broad, but essentially these are top-down processes. So you do need to have access to the cognitive thinking when you're choosing a strategy, and maybe some visual support to help with that. Often to choose a bottom-up strategy like a sensory diet strategy to help you at that time. So you feel you're in the high zone, or you're getting to the high zone, so you choose to go jump on the trampoline to get yourself more organized. Okay, I think relationships are really, really the most powerful, even though sensation can be really powerful too. This is particularly important for children and where there's development and learning challenges. The ability to co-regulate comes before the ability to self-regulate. And actually we all co-regulate throughout our life, but particularly as a small child, that comes first. And I heard Dan Siegel speak about a study where they looked at a more disorganized brain, and he talked about a lot of mental health challenges. When you have the colorful blobby scans that they do, those brain scans that have the blobs go front and back and left and right and top and bottom, and they move like that. In a lot of mental health challenges, you end up with pockets, and they're more rigid sort of structures, and they don't flow, and they're less flexible. And so we might call that a disorganized brain. But when a disorganized brain connects with an organized brain who has those flowy blobs, what we see is very quickly when they have that meaningful connection, that their brain starts to connect left, right, top, bottom, front, back. And so meaningful engagement and connection is really powerful for supporting regulation. So we can engage that co-regulation system by first and foremost being present, putting down the phone and being 100% present. I find we get distracted a lot, but just being present with someone can make the world of difference. Be aware, so you're going to stop, observe, think, read their cues, think about the cues you're giving off. And we really want to connect before we direct. If I could teach every teacher this and every parent this would be amazing. So this needs a lot more detail to flesh it out, but essentially we can observe their body, their posture and movement, their body face and mouth, their emotional tone, their voice, breath, heart rate, and their autonomic signals. That'll tell us, are they getting heightened, or are they too low and disengaged for what I'm wanting them to do at the moment? So that we can tune into them and really get a sense of where they are. Don't just rely on words. Words can be deceiving, but the body never lies. So we're going to look for the meaning and the intent in the situation rather than just listening to the words. And so we want to connect and help them recover when they're in that high or agitated, overexcited zone. And we're going to do that through co-regulation in the relationship. What I want to tell you is we always co-regulate with people around us. We do it with our spouse and siblings and friends. And when your spouse comes home and they're really stressed out, you have to do a lot to keep yourself grounded, or for my wife, it's the other way around. But essentially, you're going to co-regulate or you're going to co-dysregulate. And so we want to be the stronger rhythm so that then we can help the person be more regulated. So we do that by, firstly, I look inside and I find that if the other person's heart's beating fast and breath's going fast and I haven't tuned into myself, that's happening inside me as well. So my heart's going fast, my breath's going fast. The first thing to do is for me to take a deep breath. And that often helps me feel a lot more grounded. We can use our voice, so we can have a calming voice and a soothing voice, or a voice that does the opposite. Intensity without volume. I often find that a whisper actually captures attention a lot more than a loud booming shout. Because when I whisper, it sounds like something important is going to happen, right? We can use our body and our presence to have an open posture and our emotional expression on our face. So we want to be open, inviting, caring, and comforting. And that will help connect when we're present, and we can support, an organized brain can support a disorganized brain become more organized, be more grounded, and co-regulate. Okay, in terms of the environment, thinking about what we want to do and how we want to pull in attention, not overwhelm the systems. We want to reduce distractions or overwhelming sensory input, so that's visual, auditory, tactile input. Teachers are always proud. I remember doing a school visit and the teacher, I went in there and there was work on all four walls. There was fishing line running diagonally with body murals, and he sat at the back of the class and she said, "I just don't know why you can't pay attention." And I was like, who said that? I want teachers to be proud, but we also need to be aware of how overwhelming and how can we draw our attention to what's most important. We also want to consider the individual that we're working with and thinking, well, what's the best placement in the class for this person? Is it the front or the back or the side? And what we might find is that, if someone's a little bit edgy and they're a little bit defensive, then we don't want everyone behind them because their focus is going to be behind them. Maybe we might move them to the back of the room or the side of the room. If they're distracted by everyone in front of them, we might move them away from the front. If they're visually distracted, we might move them up to the front. So it's about looking at the individual child. Sometimes we always compromise with off to the side. And then we can look at the seating and postural adaptation. So this also overlaps with that sensory piece, that sensory motor posture piece. In terms of task, so we can modify the tasks to meet the child's developmental level. So we want to have that just right challenge so that it's not too easy and not too hard, so that it's engaging. Remember that engagement really helps. diminish tics if people are engrossed in an activity because they're feeling that sense of flow. We can scaffold for success, as I said, just right challenge. We want to consider where the individual is today, and that's some of the problem. And I think also with the waxing and waning is that people often set their expectations when things are at their best, and things can be different from yesterday to today. Actually, they can be different from this morning to this afternoon, or from 10 minutes ago to now. And so we need to use our skills to tune in and read the person and be able to support who they are right now. We can use strategies to help them understand tasks and feel more organized with stop, think, do. They're more those cognitive strategies that they need to be regulated for, but when they are, they can access those. And we want to make it meaningful. Again, being connected and engrossed in an activity and meaningful occupations are really a powerful way to reduce tics and to stay regulated. And those meaningful interactions and play a part of that too. So again, that relationship is important. Predictability in what we do provides structure and routine. And so this allows a person to feel safe knowing what's happening and maybe decreasing that fear of the unknown or the unexpected. So I'm not talking about over-structuring, but understanding the predictable rhythms of the day can be really powerful. Other ways for predictability is supporting to understand when there's going to be changes in routine or novelty. Using social stories is a good way to sort of rehearse what's going to happen that might be challenging ahead of time while they're regulated so that they can understand what's coming up. And visual modeling is another way of doing things too. Allowing children to preview work is a way of not being stressed out when they have learning challenges and it's hard to ask questions in class. And visual supports can be quite powerful. So in terms of visual supports, there are things like time timers, visual schedules, making ways of highlighting important information first and then, social stories, video modeling. These are all things that you can get more information about. And if someone is having trouble predicting and being worried about what's coming up, they might be relevant. Sometimes people bucket the idea of using visuals or visual schedules, but it can be words too if people can read. My diary is a visual schedule. And if I forget my diary when I go to work, I call my wife and get her to send me photos of it so that I can feel more organized and know what's happening and know what's coming up in my day. Even though I could probably narrate my whole week verbally to you, I want to be able to see that so that I don't have to store it in my mind. Okay, so just to summarize again, tics have that waxing and waning process. So when they're heightened, if we can support regulation, that can really help. They can be reduced when people are engrossed, so getting meaningful activities, really getting the tasks right and those meaningful interactions. They're impacted by the environment and occupation. The environment is physical and sensory, but also that social environment. And those premonitory urges are there. So you need to be, if you want to be able to use those as a sign to be able to support them, we need to have access to that higher level thinking to tune into it. So we need to be regulated. And there's that significant comorbidity that often those other challenges have regulatory challenges associated with them. And the strategies we have can reduce milder symptoms, can reduce those exacerbations arising from stress or excitement, and they can allow that just right level of arousal for learning and retrieving other strategies like the CBIT and habit reversal training. And these are strategies that are accessible, easy to implement, and cost-effective and relatively risk-free. And in order to sort of work on regulation in a dynamic way, we want to take into account the sensory motor posture, take into account the task, the environment, the predictability, self-monitoring, and interaction. Okay, that's me done.
Fantastic, Dave. And you are just so on time. I'm so impressed. That's brilliant. That was excellent. The chat was, really going off with lots of people loving what you were talking about and certain things that I heard in there as well. Some really key phrases that we'll pull out, which are really helpful to remember. Direct, that
connect before you direct.
Yeah, that one, that was fantastic. You really get it. And a lot of people in the chat were just saying it's so good to hear someone that's an OT that really actually gets Tourette's within that space. So that's really wonderful to hear. Now, we do have a few questions. We've we're supposed to end now, but we do have a 15-minute buffer before the next session. So if you're available just for a few more minutes, could we ask?
Yeah, absolutely. When you said I'm on time, I'm actually 5 minutes late because I knew you wanted questions. That's fine.
Thank you.
I won't be offended.
The first one you might... That's okay. The first one you might have covered, because I did see a reference to this, but do you know if the Wilbarger protocol can help children with TS in developing regulation?
So the Wilbarger protocol is a protocol that, so Pat will tell you it's primarily for people who are sensory defensive, so who over-respond to their senses, but it is a deep pressure touch protocol. So I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but it really is it's a protocol for deep pressure touch tends to be grounding input to the body and has a modulating input, which should help calm you when you're high and support you to wake up when you're low. In terms of the protocol, it is designed for sensory defensiveness, and that is the limits that it's within, although actually a lot of the studies aren't around that, so it's showing reduction in anxiety and stress as outcomes. It's still building a body of knowledge. But so I would say it is a deep pressure strategy that tends to always be regulating, but it's something that you should learn from an occupational therapist who has been trained in it, and it really should be used primarily with people who have sensory defensiveness.
Thank you.
So yes, it could if they've got those symptoms.
Great, thank you. Dave, are you suggesting this is overall regulation training for the individual to therefore assist, or is there more specific things to help deal with specific tics?
No, I'm not being specific to tics. And I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't consider myself an expert like the people who've come before me. I would just say that I feel like we all do better when we're regulated, but there are those signs, like I said, that we see that when it's heightened, and actually I think there's some research to suggest that when you're too low and you're a bit disengaged, they can come out a little bit too. So you want to be more in that just right zone. I think there's opportunities for sensory diet activities to be coupled with some of those outlet type strategies. But I can't point you to specific research to support that. And I am speaking more generally.
Okay. And Dave, what about interoception? Is that considered in therapy regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really growing in popularity. I think particularly in the last year, that is growing in popularity. We have literally just spent way too much money on a textbook around interoception, but yeah, sensory is not just your sights and smells and the ones I couldn't remember during the presentation, not just your 5 senses. You're right. And so OTs then extend it to vestibular and proprioception, and interoception is probably the 8th sense that you could pull into that and that awareness inside as well.
Brilliant. We did get asked, would you move to Victoria? So someone else has put in the chat with of an OT who is familiar with Tourette's in Melbourne, and also we have other OTs in the chat that are here and loving learning about this as well. So yeah.
I would say someone who's willing to learn is possibly just as good as this piece, because we're not going to be doing, it's unlikely we're going to be doing things like the habit reversal training or the CBT. That's probably going to be more your psychologist, but there are a lot of good OTs who are able to support regulation in a broad sense, particularly from a sensory perspective, but there's a lot more relationship-based OTs. So looking at someone who has DIR floor time training will know how to engage the child. And then a lot of these the predictability and task strategies, OTs and speeches are doing all over the country.
All right, that's a fabulous answer, and I agree. I mean, my first psychologist I saw with my son many years ago had not had a Tourette's patient before, but was so willing to learn. Joined TSAA, and I ended up getting her back to be a specialist speaker. You know, a few years later, because she was just the absolute toolkit we needed at that time. I'd also think
about knowing your limits too. You know, it's not trying to do the stuff that you're not trained in. You can learn those, and if you get trained in them, great. But I think there is a role in supporting regulation that gives you access to those other things that can maybe control the milder ones, that can make it less likely for those exacerbations to happen. But yeah, knowing your limits and then learning from there.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think from the reaction we've had and getting access to you, I think that having an OT registry with us as well would be really valuable for our membership moving forward.
Oh,
so, we'll definitely be in touch trying to gather more resources and supports for our members, because it does make a big difference. That we've had some people in the chat say they're going in to see an OT, but they can't get the right treatment. So it's getting the right match of people sometimes as well is just as valuable. So thank you. I think I've exhausted the questions that came through. I'm just checking. Yep, I think thank you for asking. We've had fabulous response. So thank you very much for giving us your expertise today and joining us and being our first ever OT guest speaker.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for letting me sit on the rest of the day. I learned a lot today.
Brilliant. So for everyone else on the call, we will be reconvening at 3 p.m. for the next session, which is my session. So I'll see you then. Thank you.